Okay, great. Well, we are back with another episode of Gravity Podcast. Today's guest is Wanona Satcher. Wanona, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the invite, Brett. Looking forward to getting into the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. I am really admiring what you're doing, and we'll get to that. But keeping with our format, we want to hear kind of everything that's led you to this point. So maybe you could just kind of back up a little bit and start kind of at the beginning and tell us a little bit about your childhood, your kind of early upbringing, family dynamics, and who you were and all of that.
Sure. Yeah, at the beginning. So originally I'm from Atlanta, born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Southwest, call it SWAT, Southwest Atlanta, too strong. And really, surrounded by family members, community members that were entrepreneurial in spirit, but extremely community focused. And of course, being from a city like Atlanta, you are also surrounded. I was also surrounded growing up with, civil rights leaders, the bedrock of a large civil rights community. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born here. His family, Ralph David Abernathy, Andrew Young. I mean, just an amazing space to be born and raised in, and not just from that standpoint, but just from the standpoint of diversity and inclusion. And so, I've always grown in a space surrounded by this notion that there's always an obligation to do more for others, and do it in a way that was where you're meeting people where they are. And so, early on, I would say probably around fourth grade, I started to do a lot of drawing of buildings and countless hours on the floor in the middle of the living room in our split level house, playing with trucks and dump trucks and crayons and creating. Well, that I didn't really know what I was doing, honestly. Subconsciously, I probably did. But now looking back, I would say consciously, I was doing what I'm doing now. I was preparing for what I'm doing now, which is literally building and developing communities. And I remember my grandmother would say, you need to take a break off those knees and put some knee pads on. No, I'm strong, good. And of course, now I have knee problems, right? But it was all in preparation for what I'm doing now. So definitely, working class family. One of the things that I would say that was quite interesting was during middle school and high school. Unfortunately, and kind of fortunately, but really unfortunately, I was part of the busing system, still busing kids from one neighborhood to a better neighborhood for schools. And so I would have to take two buses to get to school and two buses to get back home. One of those, it's weird because in one sense, yes, that does provide you with a level of opportunity to go to a better public school. But at the end of the day, the questions in the back of my mind included, why do I have to do that when, we should be able to have the resources available in our community, in my community, so I can walk, live, thrive, where, at the same space. So I think a culmination of all of those experiences, from starting early, drawing and building cities with crayons and using my Barbie dolls as road bumps. I hated dolls. I saw no point within them. So I use them as part of the built environment. And my family actually encouraging them, creating that space and holding that space to always support and promote and push being as creative as possible, never knowing any bounds or any impossibilities, definitely has led to the person that I am today. I would also say early on, my grandmother, my mom, they really pushed a practice of, especially my grandmother, a practice of meditation and mindfulness at a very, very, very young age. And in fact, looking back on it, from a psychological standpoint, I started getting into that around 10 years old, 10, 11, when I think a lot of that pre-adolescence is starting to take place. And your mind is just a wonderful space to attract ideas, not think that there's anything as consequence or impossibility. And so that practice of mindfulness and meditation early on set the tone for attracting a certain type of lifestyle and also practicing a certain type of lifestyle, whether it's professionally through my work or personally how I interact with people today. And so, of course, I definitely encourage all parents to do that with their kids at a young age, because it really does mold how you treat people and how you live and how you actually how you understand and decipher information, being very mindful of things, asking the right questions to get to certain answers. And so with that being said, taking 2 school buses to school, studying on the bus, taking hours to get home, being around a lot of students from various different backgrounds and creeds and value systems, all walks of life, Black and Brown and Indigenous kids, in a space that was heavily surrounded by civil rights activists and entrepreneurs, definitely leads you to an interesting future. And what does it mean to build conscious communities? And what does it mean to curate experiences versus creating experiences that everybody else can curate them? And I think I resonate in the middle of that space now. And so went through, graduated high school, went through that whole teen weird phase, but still practicing this notion of mindfulness and meditation all through that time. And honestly, I think that I was better at math and science during those practices of meditation and mindfulness. I was more creative actually than I am now because of those practices, to be honest with you. And I haven't practiced it as much as I used to. So I'm trying to get back into that. It's like riding a bike, it's definitely a practice.
Yeah. And I'd love to dive in. I've been an avid meditator for a long time now, and want to talk to you about that. And I want to just go back a little bit though, because there was some things you said a lot, and I really appreciate kind of hearing your story as you've shared it. There's some threads there that felt, really important to me that I think hopefully will be important to our audience. The kind of, you said, I think 4th grade, where you started to kind of draw some buildings and play with the trucks. And, I think oftentimes people really see that as childhood play, that it's not necessarily something that might be coming out of you, that might be a part of you, that might even be part of your purpose for being. It's written off as play. And maybe not as much today. People might grasp the idea of, really loving your work and finding passion. And, a lot of that, seems to be a lot more prevalent today than it was when I was in college and, kind of getting started in my career. But I think that's really, really important to kind of dig into, a lot of what you said, even the kind of civil rights activism that you were experiencing, that you were surrounded by. I'm kind of curious how much of this was, in hindsight, you can go back and look at the things that were coming up and were potentially, a part of your path, and how much of it was like, even at a young age, there was some sort of felt experience that there was something important happening or something that felt alive to you. Did you get that at the time, or was that just kind of your environmental normal? Talk a little bit more about it, what it was like at that early stage to be having those experiences.
That's a good question, or good question. So I would say that 200%, those experiences have culminated into what I'm doing professionally and who I am personally now. I wouldn't say, so I would say this, being that young, I didn't know how to articulate what was happening. And I didn't know it was preparation for what I'm doing now, but I did know that it was natural. I did know that it was the easiest thing that I had ever done up till then, which, only 4th grade, 4th, 5th grade, but it was the easiest. It just felt like that's something I should be doing. I think I was on my path to my purpose, but I couldn't really articulate it that way. Luckily, though, that's why I'm so proud that I had a good support system, because it was that support system, the adults in the room, the parents, the grandparents. My mom was a single mom, but I was surrounded by my mom and grandparents, aunts. They listened and they encouraged that preparation for purpose. And I remember my grandmother used to tell me in my 20s, I never knew what you were thinking about all those hours on the floor. I always wondered what you were thinking. And I couldn't remember, but except for I liked figuring out how systems, how different components are put together to create a holistic space, a system. And to me, all the little pieces of the city and the pieces of how the crayons created this street, and how, in my mind, it was all about putting something together without caring about the outcome. It was pure creativity. And I will say also, I kudos to my parents, because I literally would take up the entire living room with this city on the floor, these neighborhoods, and they would never kick them out the way, yell at me, fuss, pick up this, clean this up. It was always encouraging to do more of that. So from an environmental standpoint, that was the positive reinforcement to keep going, to keep experimenting, to keep exploring, to keep figuring out whatever it is you're trying to figure out without someone telling you that's what you should be doing. So it was, again, I think that's where I really learned the balance of holding my parents, holding that space for me, curating the space, the home environment for me to be able to explore, but also allowing me to curate my own experiences, and whatever that might be, figure it out later. I will say that the meditation and the mindfulness space, I'm not sure why that was so heavily encouraged, but it was. And I do know that my parents were smart enough to realize that you have to have that other dimensional space to be able to do well academically or do well personally. The activism piece wasn't even a question. I mean, there was no asking me if I wanted to be an activist or go to a community meeting or sit at. I went to a Black Panther meeting once at a young age. Or volunteer at a soup kitchen at age 7. It wasn't even. There was no question whether I was going. Like you're going to get in the car, and that's what we're going to do. And so, leading it was all about practice. Practicing a life of service was nothing new to me, and practicing creativity and to not be stifled was nothing new to me. Now, parents weren't sure what media, whether I would be a painter, whether I would be an author, but how I was exploring life was through objects and putting things together and figuring things out. I don't necessarily know what I was figuring out, but in hindsight, 2020, yeah, that definitely is. That's what I'm doing now, is figuring out how to create equitable systems and looking at all the pieces, analyzing all the pieces, and then synthesizing them into spaces that allow others, or hopefully inspire others, to create their own change. But there is a level of empathy that comes with that. And that came from the community activism that I was doing as a kid that translated into what I'm doing professionally now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm wondering, I'm just sitting here thinking about your family and, what really like incredible people. I think it sounds like, I'm wondering, I get the activism piece and the civil rights. Like I get, where that comes from.
Mm-hmm.
I am curious about the mindfulness and also the kind of idea around purpose, and maybe those two things are together. But like, have you talked with your family about kind of how that came into their lives and how they were able to adopt that mindset as parents, grandparents, for modeling that for another generation? That seems relatively unique. I mean, that at that time you had a family that was really kind of and what I would imagine, what I believe, like doing all the right things, I mean, and I don't know if that's true, but like they're definitely doing some things right to be raising kids with a tool like mindfulness, to be raising kids to be thinking about being active and solving injustice in the world, to raising kids to think about career, work, purpose. That's rare. even still today. So I'm wondering, do you know a little bit about kind of how they arrived at that place?
Yes and no, more no. And those are really, that's a really good question. I will try to answer that question by what they did. And so, my grandmother, who was she was an extreme activist in the civil rights space and marching. She also worked for 20 plus years in a mental health institution here in Atlanta. And what was interesting about that experience for me was that's when so number one, she had an interest in that work. But, back in the 60s, 70s, especially 70s and 80s, early 80s, African Americans were only hired in a lot of situations to get low-paying government jobs. But she had an interest in psychology and multiple personalities and schizophrenia and all these different psychological challenges. And she introduced me actually to Clockwork Orange, Salvador Dali, surrealism, just a very interesting mix of, at a very young age, looking at the mind. And she was also very vocal about things she felt. So if she would have panic attacks, and she would explain to me, "This is what I'm having." So at a young age, what's happening to other people. Stand back and try to understand their experience, be as empathetic as possible, but also learn the difference and the value between lashing out as a reaction, but also showing restraint. And the value of restraint in the civil rights movement, of things we had to do to take, but the value of speaking out for yourself. And she always spoke out for other people. And so on one hand, I had her, and then my mom worked in the library system forever. And so constantly being around, there's so many books in our house now, and there's books and reading. She was also a fan of horror. And so I was a fan of horror at a young age, and science fiction, and the idea of different dimensions and space and exploration at a very young age. Like a lot of kids, looking at science fiction movies. Stephen King, one of my favorite authors. I was introduced to that early on. My aunt, my mom's younger sister, is a physician, and so she's very colorful and very creative in her respect. And so growing up, actually went to one of her classes during summer vacation at medical school here in Atlanta, Morehouse School of Medicine, and stayed the whole day with her. One of her projects was she had to put together this skeleton to learn the bones, and literally I took her box of bones and put the entire skeleton together. I was probably middle school then, just looking at a book, again, going back to this whole notion of figuring things out, figuring out how all the pieces work together. My grandfather worked at the railroad, at Norfolk Southern Railroad Company here in Atlanta, and he loved tinkering, loved figuring things out, loved math, but in a way that was not what we consider maybe academically, but in a way that we consider creative. So I can tell you what they did and how all those pieces fit together, but I've never directly asked, why did they parent that way? Yeah. I do also remember I went to Montessori school at a very young age, and my grandmother said, one of the things she wanted to do was to figure out the best educational space where I could be myself and be taught in a way that fit my how I learn, basically, which is why I really do like the Montessori school and Waldorf school method of teaching. And I wasn't there for long. In fact, the only memory I have is washing dishes. Like, I don't even remember what else happened. I was so young. But this idea of being very self-sufficient and being self-sustaining was taught at an early age. I will also say this. I have taught with other of my colleagues and just people that I know from Atlanta as well, same age as me, who also mirrored some of the same kind of lessons early on. So I don't know if there's this thing going on in Atlanta, especially for Black and brown kids. But I do know a lot of that just had to do with being surrounded by people who didn't apologize for wanting to move the needle forward. And that it just resonated. It's just something that's just natural. So what I'm going to do, Brett, is take that question today and ask my mom.
Well, that's great.
should do that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, and I'd love to kind of hear more about what she says. But I'm guessing that you probably learned the answer or something close to it by just observing what they actually did.
Mm-hmm.
So you're probably right. I mean, and really, I think most people would say that it's more about how we role model than it is, what kind of wisdom we impart on the next generation. It's really more our actions that might, make the biggest impact. And all of those threads, each one of the people in your life, family members that, were role modeling various ways to be that are inspiring, would make perfect sense that, but what I guess maybe I would wonder is like, well, what led them to that point?
Yeah.
But that's probably a whole nother episode. Why don't you take me a little bit, forward now as you start to kind of get into your young adult years, high school, college, like what emerges for you at that time in life?
Yeah. So I ended up, again, after the two bus system and busing all over the place, I ended up graduating high school and attending Auburn University, College of Architecture, Design, and Construction for undergrad and grad. And so I graduated from Auburn, dual degree in the graduate programs of landscape architecture and city planning. And it's funny because I actually started Auburn as an architecture student and realized very quickly that designing a building is okay. But when you're able to design a city or design a community and understand understand that what you design affects the social connections, how we can design for what I call purposeful serendipity, right? So you have these programs, you have these strategies, but the idea is to allow people to create their own collisions and sparks, and that I could have something to do with that. And then on top of that, add the city planning, the land use, talking about equity, gentrification, racism in land use and land ownership, and combining all of those pieces and the intersection of all that really resonated. In fact, that's when I started noticing, oh, I'm actually doing what I was doing when I was in fourth grade. Now it's starting to make sense. I can put words to it. I can put meaning to it. I can explain what I'm doing and build things in a tangible way and build models and renderings. So landscape architecture just makes so much more sense than just drawing a building or building a building. That just wasn't, that's so personal and individual. I really wanted something that was more holistic and understanding the ecosystems and nature and all those kinds of things. Before graduating and before my thesis work, and I always tell this story as a pivotal moment in what I do and why I do what I do today, is we were tasked with doing a project in Indianola, Mississippi for B.B. King. And we were going to design a B.B. King museum, which is where he's from, Indianola, Mississippi. And so to do that, we, of course, went to Indianola and we stayed for a week, me being my design studio. And it was the oddest experience because that was the first time, this was about 2002, 2003, where I saw, as a Black woman, seeing other Black people still picking cotton. It's where I was eating breakfast at the matriarch, the family that owned all the land, eating breakfast in her house and having Black maids coming in, literally wearing blue outfits with white hats. I felt like I was in the heat of the night, the original In the Heat of the Night. And I had never experienced that before, even though I had heard of it. And so upon leaving Mississippi, we gathered all our information. We stopped to get something to eat. And it was very still segregated town in my mind. One of the young ladies, teenagers who was working at this fast food restaurant, noticed I wasn't from there. She was asking what we were doing. And I was like, yeah, I'm ordering my food. And I'm like, yeah. We're working on this blues museum and looking at the bayou that's here and how to connect the bayou to this notion of blues music and where blues music comes from. Not something that's commercial, something that's very powerful. Talking about civil rights, all these slavery, how all these things impacted B.B. King and why, the music that he created, the magic that he created. And she said, what's the civil rights movement? I never heard of that. And that totally blew me away. In a bad way.
What year was that?
it's around 2002, 2003 when that happened. And it's one of those situations like, well, one, why did I have to hear that? What was the message? First of all, I wasn't really actually interested in the message. I was just heartbroken, to be honest with you. That was my first gut reaction. And having to take that with me and drive from Mississippi back to Auburn, which is in Alabama, there was no one I could really talk to about that or explain that feeling of what just this wash, I was like this different dimension. Like I just couldn't believe what I had heard. And even if I had time with this young lady, what would I have told her? Like, how do I bring her up to history? Like what do I say? What's the civil rights movement? This young girl didn't know anything about her history purposely. She didn't know anything about how she could contribute to this legacy. And she didn't know anything about who has contributed to her well-being. And so the dismissiveness and the lack of awareness, that really got me, Brett, like seriously. So on my way back to Auburn, and mind you, at that time, the name on the building for our architecture school is George Wallace. If anybody out there knows who George Wallace is, if you don't, I don't know what to tell you. You don't know a lot about history. I need you to Google it. But to have to leave that situation and go into a building with that name on the building just added to the reality and the frustration of what should not have been real in the first place. And so I remember calling home when I got back. My grandmother was crying. I just couldn't believe all the work that had been done. And this young girl had never heard of that. And so years later, I realized, and this was in my late 20s now, fast forward, late 20s then, that my grandmother said to me, you should not worry about whether she will ever learn that history. What you should be excited about potentially is that you changed her life just by being there. And she said, you never know what young people pick up. And that reminded me too of how I was raised. You just never, kids are sponges. Don't treat them anything less because they're younger. That's the legacy, right? And so it still sat wrong with me, but I knew that there was a reason for why that message was specifically for me. Nobody else heard that young girl but me. And so transitioning from college and that experience to my late 20s, where I started actually working in, typical architecture firms, just like a lot of design students do, thinking that's what they're going to be for the rest of their lives. I ended up getting let go because of during the recession of 2008 hit a lot, especially in that industry. That's when I started becoming, interested in entrepreneurship. And then I ended up getting a job with local government. So I started working for the city of Durham, North Carolina. And let me tell you, government is a whole different space. I only lasted 4.5 years.
Well, that's actually maybe a long time to last in that environment. But, backing up, because I think you're kind of, gracefully sharing that story, but I can imagine there was a lot of sadness and anger and emotion that, you were left with that you didn't actually know what to do with. And that's, I think, what you were describing. And I was actually wondering, like, did she really not know? Or was it like some sort of kind of passive aggressive, racism? Like, is it possible somebody really doesn't know? But, that I guess is, and I don't know which is true. And maybe you had a better sense if she was really just that, uninformed, ignorant, or if she might have been something worse than that. I don't know which is worse actually, but, it just, you said at the beginning, you were asking yourself what was the reason why I got to hear that, right? Which is a pretty, I think, mature way, kind of evolved way to even think about it to begin with. Because, the emotion might be the natural way to respond, and there's nothing wrong with that. But anger could be the prevailing emotion. And yet you're asking yourself the question, why me? What's here for me to learn? And so I'm wondering, kind of, as you start to kind of, lay out the rest of the story here, as you go through your kind of early career in the architecture work and that path, which is really common. I also started out an architecture student and shifted into city planning, mostly because I didn't have the confidence to become an architect. And there was something in there that had me actually not really wanting to do it. Part of it was not being secure and confident enough at that time to pursue that intellectually, and also, thinking that financially I could make a life for myself that way. But maybe part of me also just didn't really want to be an architect. I'm not sure, but I loved the art, the history, the creativity, the idea of building things. I did not like the idea that I had to actually understand through, statistics and physics and legal, that these buildings needed to stand for forever and without me getting sued. That part scared me. But backing up, I'm wondering, as you start to talk about going into city government, when you think back on that question you asked yourself, how did that moment inform how you started to move forward with your life and your career?
So I'll fast forward to now and work backwards to answer that question, because it wasn't until recently until I realized the answer to that. And a lot of that had to do with working for city government. And I had started an innovation lab there, which had never been done before. And of course, when you're working for city government, you're working for the people, or at least you should be. And so I realized, first of all, it was a very toxic environment, even though I learned a hell of a lot. And if it wasn't for the community support, I wouldn't have lasted even 4.5, 5 years. But what I did learn, and this was part of also having deep conversations with my family, I ended up resigning because it had gotten so toxic that the more that I did creatively, the worse retaliation I received. And it wasn't until my aunt said, we raised you to be a change agent. That's just what you grew up around, to make change. Like that's what you're used to doing and following in those footsteps. And she said, the critical thing she said was, but there are some systems you can't change. And that's when I realized, after about 5 minutes of being frustrated, like my whole life you raised me to be a change maker, I realized that she was right. And that meeting the young lady, the teenager in Mississippi, I was I was the first African-American graduate in the history of Auburn University in landscape architecture and dual degree landscape architecture and planning. Being the first in a space that wasn't hunky-dory in a sense, it was very hostile in a lot of ways. Alabama, George Wallace building, you name it. And then working in government, where you think that should be a place where there are answers for people's problems, and it's not. It's not about proactivity. It's all about responsiveness. All of that, and resigning from city government, and what my aunt said to me about you can't change some systems, I realized that that's not my purpose. That it was never about, I wasn't raised to figure out how all the pieces work to change the existing system. I was raised, in my purpose that I'm growing into every day is to create a new one and curate enough to where people like that young lady could experience life her way, to be inspired by the spaces that I develop and create, then inspire her to make a difference the way she needs to make the difference. So that's what I have realized all this time that I've been doing, that I will continue to do, and that I feel very comfortable in doing. And that is okay to not, and to understand that's my role in all of this. Because that's the other thing. I don't think enough people understand what their role actually is. And one of the things I learned being surrounded by civil rights activists and my family, my grandmother, that everybody has a different role. And it doesn't have to be on the front end all the time. Like everybody doesn't need to be protesting. All of that takes strategy. And it is a lifelong it is a lifelong job. You can't just think you're going to protest, make a difference, and then 5 months later you protest. If you're going to do it every day, and as much as you can. That is not what I am here to do. What I am here to do is to be in the background while you're protesting to break old systems. I'm building new ones. You can't have one without the other. And so now I'm starting to be more confident, especially as an entrepreneur, and more excited about being 100% happy with being that builder, being the grower in the background while everybody else is out front. Mm-hmm. And putting all the pieces together so that when it's time for a new system to evolve and to materialize, I can at least say I helped to build it, literally, and also, I think, in a way metaphysically as well. So that's what all those experiences have led me. The answer that I have received and what I am starting to feel comfortable with. I don't have to make change the way you make change. I make change and build change the way that's comfortable for me, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's take a deeper dive into these communities, and really what you're doing with your studio. I really want you to kind of share with the audience, kind of in detail. What is it? How's it? How are you doing it? What shape is it taking form in? And I think as we talked a little bit before, there's a lot of overlap in what we're trying to do, and with Gravity and Kaufman Development, and I think there's a lot of shared passion for kind of doing things in a way that is conscious and is creative and is impactful and is inclusive, and I'm actually starting to find an ecosystem full of people that shares this belief in having some real enthusiasm and excitement that there's something here that's really happening that, I don't know kind of what shape it lands in or how long it takes, but that there's some real excitement on my end that, there's people like you out there doing this work. So, and again, I think there's a lot of us out there that are thinking about it, playing with it, doing things. And so, people might want to know, how can we, work together to make things happen? So, why don't you kind of dive into your work a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, quickly on that, right before I resigned, and I said I had created an innovation lab at the city of Durham, North Carolina, and I was working with, the intersection of tech community there, Research Triangle Park, urban agriculturalists, urban farmers, musicians. I mean, you name it. It was a community engagement, code enforcement, fair housing. It's a whole realm of different parts of city life, and I had submitted this application for a grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies to create these community labs where low wealth residents would work with high wealth residents and create technologies or ideas that could support equity and upward mobility for those residents. And we were a top 20 finalists. We didn't get the top 5, but it did kind of elevate the work that I was trying to do. And this notion of, bringing in sustainability and reusing materials. And that's where I kind of came up with this idea of shipping containers. It's an abundant resource that we could use to add value. But what's even more impressive is to be able to utilize material that, in order to provide value, would require hiring local tradesmen and women to do that. Not something that's high tech, but something that's high personable, like, peer-to-peer, hiring locally, that kind of thing. And I got a lot of great feedback from food entrepreneurs, food truck owners, you name it, people who wanted to be able to have an affordable space without paying a lot of money for a brick and mortar to be able to expand their business, grow their business scale, and so forth. So once I resigned from city government in 2016, I started at Mākhers Studio 2017, moved back here to Atlanta, Georgia. It's time to come back home. And went full blown on this idea of reimagining space and utilizing small space for big impact. And again, looking at the balance of curating and inspiring people to be able to curate their own experiences, but using not a lot of resources to do it, not exploiting, not destructing, not being exploitative. And so this idea that you could take a shipping container, any modular space, and like Legos, like how I was doing when I was in fourth grade, and put the different pieces together to create small neighborhoods or backyard units. From a city planning standpoint, to create affordable housing, that's a huge conversation right now. In fact, that is really our social impact space, is affordable housing and affordable community spaces, right? Because we've met doctors. We actually pivoted last year a little bit and worked with a breast cancer surgeon here to create a pop-up breast cancer clinic. Working with our servicemen and women, in their fields, their subject expertise, and collaborating with how can we create on-demand spaces where they can afford to build them and therefore provide affordable services. And what better way to do that than utilizing modular technology? We just happen to use shipping containers because, again, it's a readily source and it's something that we could recycle and bring added value. And so this whole notion of sustainability is critical. This whole notion of being able to hire local tradesmen and women, hire local minority subcontractors, women welders, LGBTQ, people who are in the neighborhood that they can help build the change that they want. Is very important, and that we could scale that and ship those spaces anywhere around the world and ship that capacity building and efficacy around the world, literally in a box, is really what's appealing to us. And so we, focus on affordable housing, modular spaces and backyard units, but we also are interested in, and we have done, affordable art commercial spaces. And like I said, we did a pop-up affordable clinic. And so they're very versatile. The opportunities are there. We've gotten a lot of opposition from architects who cannot stand what we're doing. The interesting thing about that is that they're not my audience. My audience are those individuals who need affordable housing so that they can have a voice. Their voices can be amplified in neighborhoods where they are without being displaced, which is a gentrification issue. So that is what we do. We do consider ourselves a design, build, green manufacturing company. We are looking to scale to other cities. We just received funding. We have a little bit more to raise on this goal this year to close out the angel round. But we luckily received our first manufacturing facilities. We're really excited about that. And again, like I said, looking to scale to other cities. To logistically expand what we do, but also to hire locally, and also at a different level to reimagine this idea of a local supply chain. How can we build our own spaces? How can we have a direct connection to how we build and the materials we build so we can build healthy communities? It's not just building a house; it's building a home. Having a job, building your own entrepreneurial space for less money and less waste and less cost, and being able to deploy in less time the completion of construction. So those are all the things that we're doing now. And we cannot wait to be able to do a mixed use development, mixed with housing, commercial. We're looking to not just build and manufacture, but also become our own real estate developer so we can really be as directly related to how the environment is positively impacted and how much we can inspire others to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So, that's where we are now.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, it's really interesting. To me, we're in the process of starting to imagine a shipping container park as a part of a future phase of Gravity. And there's some stuff happening in the neighborhood. There's a makerspace. There's a fashion district initiative that's aimed at bringing kind of work to high school kids and to others that kind of are maybe not having the resources that they need or the confidence or the mentorship support to kind of step into that world. And we're seeing kind of the constant struggle in the retail space for retailers to get a start, to be able to go to a good location and also not have to worry about big build outs and personal guarantees and tenant improvements and, big rents, but yet, there's really brilliant, creative, smart people out there that have great ideas. And I really believe in kind of this, kind of pop up shipping container, micro boutique, like let's play with it, let's test it, let's see what we can do. And kind of like you, I find, all these threads in my own life. That's really the purpose for the format, is because my own belief system is that all these things that are happening along the way are really there for us to pull from and then use to create, right? And maybe we'll come back to the mindfulness piece here at the end, because for me, that has been the constant that allows me to see the opportunities and to connect the dots. And it took me a very long time to recognize that was what was happening as a result of meditation, right? But I now understand it when it happens. It's kind of happening right now, to be honest, where it's like you have a vision for a shipping container park on a particular piece of ground. I can see it. I know it's going to happen there. I know it's going to really be important in what we're trying to accomplish, and the impact and the activation and all of the pieces. But it just kind of comes to you, with like this idea, this flash of insight, right? That to me doesn't come if you don't create the space in your body and your mind. So that to me is what meditation does: is it creates space for the right things to flow in. And so look, I think that's kind of what's happening when you can recognize it, when you can again kind of create that space. There's a surrender, there's a whole kind of openness that has to happen, which can be hard because of conditioning and societal norms and expectations. But it's beautiful when you can kind of step into that space. And anyway, I guess I'm just, kind of feeling that that's what you are doing. That's been your life. And I'm really inspired by what you're creating and look forward to talking about how we can collaborate. Maybe you could wrap up with some, final thoughts, whether that be about mindfulness and kind of, how that has come and gone in your life, and maybe coming back and sometimes that's how it goes, right? But whether it be about mindfulness or any other kind of final thoughts that you want to share with our audience.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first, thanks again for this. This has been a great talk, and it's reminded me of some things that I've forgotten about myself, being so busy in the weeds. But I will definitely say that, again, when you're older, you're able to articulate more how you felt as a child. And I would say that both meditation and mindfulness are really, especially meditation has been, they both have, but meditation has been really a lifeline and an oxygen tank for me. And now being older, realizing that I can't live without it. And I would say, because you kind of alluded to this, Brett, but it really is a continuous 100%, 24/7, 365 days a year practice in creativity. And so if everything about you is focused on creativity and visioning, you're not focusing on what cannot happen. You're not focusing on the impossible. You're not focusing on the negativity. You're not focusing on problems. In fact, you're focusing on solutions. And so that then translates to me into this mindfulness practice of gratitude. And so if you focus solely on gratitude, even if it's just for 5 minutes, that brings you back to a space of being able to inspire and to be inspired and to receive, because that's important as well. And so the practice of meditation has led to a practice of mindfulness at an older age. But a practice of meditation as a child has led me to a practice of mindfulness at a later age, which now leads me to a practice of gratitude, to find those 5 minutes every day, to be literally to practice being thankful for the opportunities and experiences that you have and have yet to have. And so all of that goes into the kind of purpose you fulfill and how you fulfill that, and making room for that. And so it's all a choice. But at the end of the day, it's a practice, and it's not easy because, like you said, of the conditions of our external environment. But I implore and encourage anyone who works with kids, who has kids, who comes in contact with kids, to teach meditation. You will be amazed at how quickly, especially at that age, 10, 11 years old, how quickly that affects the creativity of a child and being comfortable and being creative. And like you said, seeing things others can't see yet, but being comfortable that there is a possibility, because we're actually we're building it. Like, that's the cool part about it. It's not just you're dreaming. You're building something that is in here that the language might not be there yet for other people to understand it, but there's an opportunity, there's a solution. And I would say the last thing with that, I met a lady when I was doing the Bloomberg thing, a young lady from China she's a real estate developer, and she said something that was very interesting. She said, I've noticed that there's the language of the grassroots and there's a language of the high growth, and we need people who can be in the middle to combine both, to create a language that brings everyone to the table. And she said, maybe that's what you're here to do. And I thought that was interesting, because we physically build tables and spaces, whether they're out of containers or whatever. But the part of the language piece of it, that very personable peer-to-peer part of it, is not something you just get a degree in. It literally is taught through empathy and mindfulness. And so we're now at that really interesting intersection of being a company that can combine the two to forward social impact. And we consider ourselves a social enterprise because of that work. So, that's where the journey has led, and really excited that now I can understand it better and can plan better for it.
Yeah, I love everything you just shared. Gratitude, for sure. I think people sometimes, kind of hear the word today and think of it as cliche or, oh yeah, got it, gratitude. But
it's not.
But it's not. And, even meditation might fall into that category. Oh, meditation, it's woo-woo. But no, these things work. I have a gratitude journal practice that's daily. My wife does. It matters. It has actually a scientific impact on your synapses. It works. It literally it works, and you might not need to know how it works. Kind of like you don't know how electricity really works, right?
Yeah.
Until flip the switch and the lights come on, right? So, I love all of that. And then, this last piece you mentioned about kind of, having what I heard you say is like this life experience and this skill set that you're able to then, create from. And that's really what I think this is all about. It's all about kind of our life experience and our skill set and our passion to create. And that, you said something earlier about kind of our roles, right? Like, not everybody is really meant to be a activist, right? Not everybody is meant to be an entrepreneur. Right? Not everybody is meant to be, a parent. I don't know, right? Like, there's all kinds of things that we do collectively that really, I think, is kind of how we start to tackle real issues, right?
That's right.
And
exactly.
that's kind of, where I've been getting a lot of energy is like finding others who have a unique ability over a shared common goal. Where it's like, there's certain things that I'm never going to do. I'm not good at. I would never really, be happy doing it. And other people who love it, right? And together, we improve. So I love that, and look forward to kind of continuing the dialogue.
It's all about the collective.
Yeah.
It's all about the collective.
There's some great things happening here in Columbus we'll talk about that, could be very supportive of social enterprise and your work. So really, again, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me here, and
thank
also
you.
for the work that you're doing. And yeah, look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Well, Brett, this has been a great conversation. I wish we could do this every day. It's so needed and very healing. So I'm so glad that we were connected through the Summit community, and finally able to do connect and do a podcast. And anytime you want to do another one, let me know. This is great.
Wonderful. Great. All right. Thanks, Wanona. I appreciate it.